Alright, so I need to get this off my chest. There's no easy way to say this, but my whole life just blew up in my face last week. And the worst part? It happened at my neighbor's Halloween party. I never thought I'd be that guy who has to write this, but here we are. Last Saturday, our neighbor Tom throws his annual Halloween bash. It's kind of a big deal around here. Everyone shows up, and there's always this whole costume contest thing. Jessica, my wife, loves these parties. She goes all out, planning costumes, rehearsing whatever she thinks is going to win people over this year. For 2024, she was set on this Bonnie and Clyde duo costume with me. She even ordered vintage outfits, had fake guns, the whole 9 yards. Here's where it gets interesting. A couple of weeks before the party, Jessica suddenly changes her mind about our costumes. Says she wants to go as a sexy pirate because, in her words, Bonnie and Clyde is too played out. Now, this would have been whatever, except I already knew why. See, the switch wasn't really about costumes. My buddy Rick had been dropping hints for weeks. He's the kind of guy who picks up on everyone's secrets without trying. He tells me Jess has been talking about some dude named Mike from her work like he's the funniest guy on earth. He even mentioned catching them having what looked like a very close conversation at a local bar during one of those casual happy hours her office throws. Rick didn't want to stir the pot, but he knew what I needed to hear. But it wasn't just Rick. Little things started adding up. Jessica kept going on these work meetings that conveniently always ran late. Her phone was glued to her hand, and when she wasn't texting, she had this sly grin that used to be reserved for me. But then, she'd get defensive if I asked what was so funny or why she was acting different. She had an excuse ready for everything. Now fast forward to Tom's Halloween party. She's dressed in this elaborate pirate costume, complete with fishnets and thigh-high boots, and I'm standing there as a half-assed version of Clyde with a fake gun and a suit that didn't match. I spent most of the night pretending to laugh at dumb jokes and avoiding people who kept asking where Jessica was. Because that was the thing. She wasn't around me most of the night. About an hour into the party, I see her talking to Tom's wife, and then she slips away through the back door of the house. I had this weird gut feeling. Something in my head just kept ringing like an alarm. I'm not the jealous type, but when your wife is giving you cold shoulders at a party where you're both supposed to be a pair, it's hard to ignore. So, I made up some excuse about needing fresh air and headed out the same back door she did. Now, Tom's house backs up to this little garden area, and beyond that is a garage where they store all their old furniture and tools. It's usually locked during these parties, but when I walked past, the door was slightly open, and I heard voices inside. I could feel my pulse racing in my neck. I wasn't sure if I should listen or just burst in. It felt like I was about to walk into something straight out of a trashy TV drama. I pushed the door open, and there they were. Mike, the hilarious work buddy, was leaning against the wall while Jessica was whispering something to him, laughing quietly. They didn't even notice me for a solid 5 seconds. 5 seconds that felt like an eternity where all those doubts crystallized into rage and disbelief. And then she looked up. Her face went pale like she'd seen a ghost. Everyone froze, and the air in that garage turned to ice. I could barely process what I was seeing, and I couldn't think of a clever line or a cool reaction. So I just said, clear as day, "Are you freaking kidding me, Jess?" Mike tried to act casual, like this wasn't a big deal. He put his hands up in this stupid defensive way and said, "Hey man, it's not what you think." Jessica stood there, jaw clenched, eyes darting around like she was looking for a way to escape. You'd think she'd have something to say, some kind of excuse ready, but she just stuttered and blurted out, "It's just, not what?" I shot back. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. And then, in the most dismissive tone imaginable, she looks at me and says, "Don't make a scene, Greg. It's a party." That's what she cared about, making a scene. Not the fact that she got caught sneaking off with this douchebag in a pirate outfit. Not the fact that I was standing there feeling like my world just got flipped upside down. Nope. She was worried about what people at the party might think if they saw this going down. Before I knew it, my voice was louder than I realized, and I said something like, "Oh, don't worry, Jess. I won't make a scene. I'll just let everyone know what a loyal wife you are." I guess my voice carried, because a few seconds later, I heard Tom and some other people from the party rushing over. It was like a movie where you're watching your life fall apart in slow motion. Tom came in, looked at Mike, then at me and just went, "Dude, what the hell's going on?" And in that moment, I had a choice. Keep this quiet and deal with it later, or just let the dam burst. So, I told him and everyone standing around what I had walked into. That's when the real fireworks started. That as soon as the words left my mouth, it felt like the whole house sucked in a collective breath. People were whispering, eyes darting from me to Jessica, like they were waiting for the next line in some twisted soap opera. Jessica's face turned crimson, and I could almost see her brain spinning to find some way out of this. But she wasn't fast enough. Mike, this smug idiot, steps forward like he's gonna play peacemaker. Greg, listen, I know how this looks, but we were just talking, he says, holding up his hands again like that's going to somehow diffuse this whole thing. I looked him dead in the eyes and said, talking? Really? Then why are you out here hiding in a garage, away from everyone else? My voice was steady, but my insides felt like they were on fire. I was daring him to try and keep lying to my face. Jessica tried to step in front of him, blocking my line of sight. Greg, stop. You're blowing this way out of proportion, she hissed through gritted teeth. The nerve of her, acting like I was the problem in this situation. Like catching your wife sneaking off with another guy in the middle of a party was just some minor inconvenience. Out of proportion? I repeated, laughing bitterly. You ditch me, sneak out here with him, and I'm supposed to pretend like this is nothing? Before she could respond, Tom's wife, Cheryl, showed up. Cheryl has this sixth sense for drama, and I could tell she'd been waiting for something to explode all night. She strolled in, eyes flickering between me, Jessica, and Mike. What's going on here? She asked in this calm but nosy tone, as if she hadn't already pieced together half of it. Jessica opened her mouth to say something, but I didn't give her the chance. I caught my wife here having a little private chat with her work buddy, Mike, sneaking around, whispering like they're in high school. The words came out harsher than I expected, but there was no turning back now. Jessica visibly flinched. Cheryl's eyebrows shot up, and that's when I realized more people were gathering at the door, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of whatever drama was unfolding. Mike tried to keep playing it cool, even threw up a quick, sheepish grin like this was all just a big misunderstanding. We were just talking, he repeated, because apparently that was the best he could come up with. Dude looked like he'd rehearsed this line 100 times in the mirror and was sticking to his script. Jessica, on the other hand, was losing her composure. She threw her hands up in frustration, eyes welling up, and snapped, "Why are you doing this, Greg? Can we just talk about this in private?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Now she wanted privacy, after sneaking off into a freaking garage with this guy. Private? Jess, you haven't been private about anything with me for months, I practically yelled. There it was, the boiling frustration spilling over after all those late nights, the dodged conversations, the lies wrapped in half-truths. That's when she dropped the mask completely. Her face twisted into this condescending sneer I hadn't seen before. "Oh, so now you're playing the victim? You've barely even been here, Greg. Always working late or out with your buddies?" She spat, trying to flip the blame back on me like she'd been waiting to unload this speech for months. Now, for context, I work in construction management. My hours are unpredictable, but it's not like I'm out partying every night. Most nights, I come home, eat dinner, and crash because the job drains me. And yeah, maybe I wasn't super attentive, but damn, I didn't think I had to put a freaking GPS tracker on my wife to keep her from sneaking off with some random dude. Don't even try that, I fired back. I'm working to keep this family going, while you're out here playing dress-up with Mike in someone else's garage. Her face contorted, the anger turning into something sharper, almost vindictive. "You're never around, Greg," she retorted, her voice dripping with bitterness. "I'm practically raising these kids by myself while you're off doing whatever you want." That was a low blow, and she knew it. I could see Mike shifting awkwardly, like he wanted to vanish into the floor. Good. Let him be uncomfortable. Cheryl stood there, wide-eyed, looking like she was mentally taking notes for her gossip circle. "Wow," I said, shaking my head in disbelief. "So that's your excuse? I'm busting my ass to provide for this family, and you think that justifies sneaking around behind my back?" Before she could answer, Cheryl jumped in, because why not add more fuel to the fire? "Jessica, this isn't the first time you've been seen with him," she muttered, loud enough for everyone around to hear. My stomach dropped, and the room seemed to get even quieter. Cheryl's words lingered like cigarette smoke, making the whole thing reek of betrayal. Jessica whipped her head towards Cheryl, eyes wide with panic. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, but there was no denying it. Everyone in the room could tell there was something more going on here. And then Mike, the genius that he is, chimed in, trying to sound all noble. "Cheryl, this isn't any of your business. He took a step forward, placing a hand on Jessica's shoulder as if he had any right to do that. My fists clenched involuntarily, and for a split second, I actually considered decking him. But I didn't, because I wasn't going to give him or Jessica the satisfaction of turning me into the crazy, jealous husband. "Get your hands off my wife," I said low and steady. Mike hesitated, looking between me and Jessica like he wasn't sure what was going to happen next. She didn't move to push him away, which told me more than anything else could have. Tom had finally made his way into the garage, having heard the commotion. He didn't even ask questions, just stared at Jessica and Mike with this disappointed, disapproving look. "Jess," he said quietly, shaking his head. It was a single word, but it carried so much weight. That's when Jessica finally broke down. The strong, dismissive facade cracked, and she started to cry. Not the kind of sobbing you see in movies where it's all dramatic and heart-wrenching, but this silent, angry cry that made her look like she was desperately trying to hold on to whatever control she thought she had left. She turned towards me, reaching out as if to touch my arm. "Greg, please, let's just go home and talk about this," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "Talk about what, Jess?" I asked, taking a step back. "What's left to talk about?" At that moment, I felt something break inside of me. It wasn't just the betrayal or the lies or the embarrassment. It was the realization that this whole time, Jessica had been someone else entirely, a stranger wearing my wife's face. I walked out of the garage without another word, feeling like I was leaving more than just a party behind. I didn't even stop to see if she was following me. As I pushed through the crowd of partygoers who had been eavesdropping, I felt the weight of their stares and whispers, like a pressure building in the back of my head. When I got outside, the cold October air hit me like a slap to the face. It was the only thing keeping me grounded as I made my way to my car. I heard Jessica calling my name, but I didn't turn around. Couldn't. If I did, I knew I'd see her standing there, and I wasn't sure I could handle that right then. I got in the car, slammed the door, and just sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Felt like I was on the verge of either breaking down or losing my mind. But I didn't do either. I just drove. The drive home was a blur. I don't even remember the streets or the red lights I might have run. It was like my body was moving on autopilot while my mind replayed everything that had just happened. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard they ached. The garage scene kept looping in my head. Every word, every expression, every sneer Jessica threw my way, and that look on Mike's face, like he was trying so hard to stay cool. But deep down, he knew he'd just blown up my life. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet, like nothing had happened. Kids were at my parents' place for the weekend, so at least there was no explaining to do there. I walked into our bedroom and everything looked so normal, like the bed and the picture frames and her damn perfume bottle on the dresser hadn't betrayed me too. I didn't turn on the lights, just sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, listening to the ticking of the old clock Jessica insisted we buy last year because it had character. My phone buzzed. It was Jessica. Texts came in rapid fire, one after the other. "Greg, please let me explain. I'm sorry. Can we talk? Please, I'm coming home now. Don't leave." I turned the phone face down, not wanting to see any more of her words. But the silence was worse. The house was too quiet without her fake reassurances and too loud with the thoughts in my head. I kept seeing her standing in that garage with Mike, pretending like she didn't care that her husband just walked in on them. Every time I closed my eyes, it was there, like some cruel glitch in my memory that wouldn't go away. About an hour later, I heard the door slam downstairs. Her footsteps echoed through the hallway, slower than usual, almost hesitant. She called out, "Greg, are you home?" Her voice was trembling, but it had this undercurrent of anger, like she was the one who'd been wronged. Unbelievable. She finally made her way to the bedroom, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, half dressed in that ridiculous pirate costume. Her makeup was smudged, eyes red from crying. She looked like a mess, but not the kind that made me want to comfort her. More like the kind that made me wonder how I ever believed her act for so long. She took a deep breath and started, "Greg, listen, this isn't what you think. Stop." I cut her off, not even bothering to look at her. "Just stop. Greg, please let me explain." "I don't need your explanations, Jess," I said, my voice cold. "I saw enough." She walked over and tried to sit next to me on the bed, but I got up, creating distance between us. It felt like she was polluting the air around me just by being there. I wasn't ready to hear whatever she was going to spin next, but she kept pushing. "Greg, you're blowing this way out of proportion," she said, her tone growing more defensive. "Mike and I were just talking. That's all it was. He's going through a rough time, and I was just trying to be there for him." I couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. "You were just talking?" I repeated, more out of shock than anything. "Are you kidding me, Jess?" She threw her hands up in frustration. "Yes, that's all it was, Greg. He's dealing with a divorce, and he needed someone to talk to." I let out a hollow laugh. "A divorce? So what, you're his therapist now?" Jessica's face hardened. She was shifting into that defensive mode, the one where she'd twist her words until she felt justified. "No, I'm being a friend. Something you wouldn't understand, apparently." I felt this surge of anger in my chest. "Don't you dare turn this around on me," I warned, pointing a finger at her. "You lied to me. You snuck around, and you're trying to cover it up like I'm too stupid to see what's really going on." She shook her head, her voice rising. "I didn't lie. I never did anything wrong. But you're never around. You're always working or with your friends, and I'm left here alone, trying to hold everything together." "So what?" I shot back. "That's your excuse? You think because I'm working, it gives you a free pass to sneak around behind my back?" She narrowed her eyes, and that's when I saw it. The resentment she'd been hiding all this time. "You don't listen to me, Greg. You never do. You just brush me off like I'm some background noise in your life. Mike actually listens to me. He makes me feel like I matter." And there it was. The truth she'd been holding back finally came out, and it was worse than anything I'd imagined. She wasn't just trying to justify what she did. She was telling me that it was my fault, that I drove her to this. I could feel the blood rushing to my face, the anger turning into something colder, something like pure disbelief. I forced myself to breathe, to keep calm. "So this is my fault?" I asked, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. "You chose to lie to me, to sneak around, and now you're trying to tell me it's because I didn't listen to you? Maybe if you paid attention," she muttered under her breath. But I caught it. That was it. The final straw. I could handle lies, but this blaming me for her betrayal? I felt like I was going to explode. My hands started to shake, and I had to ball them into fists to keep myself steady. I wanted to yell, to rage at her, but something inside me just shut off, like a switch had flipped, and suddenly I felt nothing at all. "Jess," I said quietly, barely holding it together. "If you're that unhappy, why didn't you just talk to me? Why didn't you try to fix this instead of running to Mike?" She blinked, and for a split second, I thought I saw something like guilt flash in her eyes. But then she closed herself off, going back to that cold, calculated version of herself that seemed so foreign to me now. "You wouldn't have understood," she said, almost like she was convincing herself. I nodded, more to myself than to her. It was like I had been trying to piece together a puzzle where the pieces didn't fit, and now I finally saw the whole ugly picture. She didn't want to fix anything. She just wanted a reason to blame me, to feel justified in whatever she was doing with Mike or whoever else might come along. I walked over to the dresser, grabbed my keys and wallet. "Where are you going?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. "Out," I said shortly, not looking back at her. I didn't know where, just anywhere that wasn't in this room with her. I needed space to think, to breathe. "Greg, please don't leave like this. We need to talk about this," she begged. But it sounded forced, like she was saying it because she was supposed to. I turned at the door, finally looking her in the eyes. "Jess, we've done enough talking. You wanted attention? You got it. But I'm done playing this game." And with that, I walked out. I heard her call my name, but I kept moving, down the stairs, out the front door, and into the cold morning air. The wind was biting, but it felt good, like something was waking me up from a nightmare. I got in the car and just drove again, no destination in mind. My thoughts were racing, the anger mixing with sadness and confusion until I couldn't tell which one was stronger. My marriage had just shattered in front of me, and all I could think was, what the hell am I supposed to do now? Eventually, I pulled into a parking lot by a park I used to go to when I needed to clear my head. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the sun come up over the trees. My phone buzzed with more messages from Jessica, but I didn't read them. Couldn't. Not yet. It was in that quiet, empty parking lot that I finally let myself cry. Not the loud, dramatic kind of crying you see in movies, but that silent, ugly crying that leaves you feeling hollow. I don't know how long I sat there, but by the time I stopped, the sun was high in the sky, and I knew what I had to do next. It was time to make some hard decisions. By the time the sun was fully up, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to keep letting Jessica twist this around or gaslight me into thinking I was somehow to blame for what she'd done. I'd seen enough, heard enough. The pity, the excuses, the way she flipped the guilt on me. It all snapped something inside me that couldn't be repaired. I checked my phone, bracing myself. There were about 20 messages from Jessica. Most of them were long-winded apologies mixed with accusations. Things like, "Greg, can't we just talk about this? You're overreacting. I'm sorry, but I wasn't doing anything wrong. You need to trust me. You have to take some responsibility in this too. Leaving won't fix this, Greg." Each text was like a jab, trying to drag me back into the twisted narrative she was spinning. I couldn't read anymore. I shoved the phone into my pocket and focused on breathing, trying to stay grounded. But the weight of everything was bearing down on me, years of trust, love, routine, all being ripped apart. I knew I had to talk to someone who'd give it to me straight. My brother, Dan, was the no-nonsense kind of guy who didn't deal in sugarcoating. I hadn't told him what happened yet, but he was one of those people who could cut through the noise and tell you what needed to be done, even if it wasn't what you wanted to hear. I drove to his place, an old bungalow on the edge of town. Dan answered the door with a look that said he'd been awake for hours, probably out jogging or working on some home project. "Greg?" he asked, eyes narrowing at the sight of me, clearly sensing something was off. "It's early. What's going on?" I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just walked past him into his living room. Dan closed the door and followed, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed.
"Sul right? Spill."
"You look like you've seen a ghost." I sat down, ran my hands through my hair, and stared at the coffee table in front of me. I couldn't look him in the eyes. "Jessica's been cheating," I said, voice barely above a whisper. The words felt heavy, like lead on my tongue. He didn't react right away, just stayed silent, waiting for me to keep going. So, I told him everything, from the small doubts to the Halloween party, and what I saw in Tom's garage. I even replayed the argument from last night, word for word, and the way she tried to spin the blame onto me. When I finished, Dan let out a long breath. "Damn," he muttered. "And you're sure she's been, you know?" I nodded. She didn't even deny it, just kept saying they were talking. "But you didn't see the way she acted, Dan. It wasn't innocent." He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly trying to think of what to say. Dan wasn't the kind of guy to jump to conclusions or freak out over small stuff. But when he spoke, his voice was serious. "Look, Greg, you know I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It sounds like she's been playing you, and now she's trying to guilt you into thinking this is your fault. You can't let her do that." "I know," I muttered, but I still felt this nagging voice in the back of my head questioning if there was something I could have done differently. Should I have paid more attention? Should I have seen this coming? Dan seemed to sense the direction my thoughts were going. "Greg," he said more firmly this time, "don't start that crap. You know as well as I do that trust goes both ways. If she had issues, she should have talked to you, not run to some other dude. You didn't make her do that." I didn't have the energy to argue. He was right, and deep down I knew it. But there was still this lingering sadness, like I was mourning the loss of something that hadn't even fully died yet. The idea of our marriage, our life, it was all unraveling before I could even process it. "What should I do?" I finally asked, voice barely holding together.
Dan dite hesitate.
"You need to get out of there, Greg. If you keep staying in that house, she'll keep trying to control the narrative. She's already manipulating the situation to make herself the victim. If you stay, it's only going to get worse." "Where do I go?" I asked, feeling a little lost. I hadn't even thought about what it meant to leave. The house, the kids' rooms, our life. It all felt like it was caving in. Dan sighed. "Look, if you need a place to crash, you can stay here. But you gotta start getting your ducks in a row. Talk to a lawyer, figure out your options. Don't just sit around waiting for her to find another way to guilt you back." A lawyer. God, I hadn't even thought that far ahead. This was all becoming too real, too fast. "What about the kids?" I asked, the thought of them hitting me like a sledgehammer. "I don't want to drag them into this mess." Dan softened a little, but he didn't back down. "They're gonna find out one way or another, Greg. You can't protect them from everything, but you can make sure this whole thing doesn't get worse. The longer you wait, the more confused they'll be when the truth comes out. And trust me, it will come out." I knew he was right, but the idea of explaining this to our kids, of telling them that their mom and dad weren't going to be together anymore, was gut-wrenching. It felt like admitting defeat, like failing them in some irreversible way. Dan saw the hesitation in my face. "I know it sucks, man, he said quietly. But you can't fix this by pretending it's not happening. You need to start thinking about what's best for you and those kids, not her. After a long pause, I finally nodded. You're right, I said, feeling something harden inside of me, a resolve I hadn't had before. I can't stay there. Dan clapped me on the shoulder, a sign of support that felt grounding in all this chaos. All right, he said, get your stuff and come back here. Don't make a big scene of it. Just grab what you need for a few days and let her know you're taking some space to think. Don't let her reel you back in with more of her manipulative crap. The word manipulative hit me like a slap. That's exactly what it was. Jessica had been manipulating me, gaslighting me even into questioning my own sanity. And now that the illusion was shattered, I couldn't unsee it. I drove back to the house with a strange sense of calm, like my body had already detached itself from the situation, leaving me to function on pure instinct. When I pulled into the driveway, Jessica's car was there. I took a deep breath, knowing this wasn't going to be easy. Walking in, I saw her sitting at the kitchen table, her face puffy from crying. The sight of her used to make me feel like home. Now it just made me feel sick. She looked up as soon as I entered, eyes wide with desperation. Greg, she whispered, as if speaking louder would shatter the thin air between us. I didn't sit down. I'm packing some things and leaving for a few days, I said, voice steady but cold. I need space to figure this out. Her face twisted in disbelief. You're leaving? She echoed, like the idea was so foreign to her that she couldn't even process it. You're just going to walk out? I'm not walking out on the kids, I corrected sharply. I'm taking time away from you. Jessica stood up, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Greg, this isn't fair, she started, her voice shaking. You can't just leave me here like this and run away from the problem. I met her eyes, and for once, I didn't feel that pull to comfort her, to believe her lies. This is your problem, Jess, I said, voice level. You created it. I'm just trying to figure out where I stand now. She took a step forward, reaching out as if to touch my arm, but I took a step back. Her hand dropped, and she looked like I'd slapped her. So that's it? She asked, her voice breaking. You're just done. I felt a flicker of anger, something hot and sharp that I'd been holding back. You made it clear last night, Jess. You'd rather justify your actions than own up to them. I'm not going to stand here and play along like everything's fine when it's not. Jessica opened her mouth to say something, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. I walked past her, up the stairs and into the bedroom. I could hear her pacing in the hallway, probably trying to figure out what angle to take next, what story to spin that might convince me to stay. I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and started stuffing in clothes, toothbrush, phone charger, basic things I'd need for a few days. My hands were shaking, but I kept moving. Focused on Theus, I packed my things. I could hear Jessica's footsteps lingering just outside the bedroom door. It was like she was trying to build up the courage to say something that might stop me. I didn't want to hear her excuses, her half-apologies, or her attempts to redirect the blame. I needed to get out of this house before I lost whatever strength I had left. But Jessica wasn't going to let it end that easily. She burst into the bedroom, eyes wide and desperate, voice laced with a mixture of anger and fear. Greg, don't do this, she pleaded, her hands trembling at her sides. We need to talk. You can't just walk out. I didn't look at her. I couldn't, not without feeling that old urge to try and fix things. Instead, I kept shoving clothes into my bag, ignoring the pain in my chest, focusing on every zipper and fold like my life depended on it. Greg, she tried again, more forcefully this time. You're not thinking straight. You're just mad, and you're blowing this out of proportion. We can fix this. That phrase, blowing this out of proportion, triggered something in me. I dropped the shirt I was holding and turned to face her, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. Fix what, Jess? You mean fix me? Fix my thinking so I just forget what I saw? Pretend like this is all in my head. Her face went pale. For once, she didn't have a rehearsed response ready to go. Instead, she clenched her fists and took a step towards me. Greg, I was going through something. Okay? I felt alone. And Mike was just there. I laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh. Oh, so he was there, and that makes it okay? I said, shaking my head. How many other guys do you need around to feel less alone, Jess? Should I just start leaving a sign-up sheet at the front door? The sarcasm seemed to sting. She flinched, but her face quickly shifted into anger. "You don't understand," she snapped, the desperation in her voice now turning into something defensive, almost hostile. "You were never around, Greg. Always at work, always busy, always too tired to listen. I was here, taking care of everything, holding the family together while you just checked out." There it was again, that twisted logic where my absence justified her betrayal. She was clinging to it like a lifeline, like if she repeated it enough times, it would make her actions acceptable. "You want to blame me for this?" I asked, my voice rising. "Fine, I wasn't around enough. Maybe I was working too much, but that doesn't give you the right to run around with Mike or whoever the hell else." Her eyes narrowed, her voice turning icy. "It's not about that, Greg. It's about feeling valued, about feeling like I mattered. And you never..." She started, but I cut her off before she could finish. "Don't you dare finish that sentence," I warned, pointing a finger at her. "I've always been here. I've always supported you, taken care of you, worked to give this family everything we needed. And the first time things got tough, instead of talking to me, you ran straight to another man. Because you wouldn't listen," she yelled back, her voice cracking. "I tried to talk to you so many times, but you just dismissed me like my feelings didn't matter." "That's not true," I shouted, the anger bubbling up like a volcano ready to explode. "You never tried to talk, Jess. You hid it all behind that fake smile and those constant, 'I'm fines.' And then you blame me for not reading your mind? How was I supposed to fix something you never even admitted was broken?" She looked at me like she was about to say something, but the words never came. Her eyes welled up, and she let out a deep, shaky breath, her shoulders slumping like all the fight had drained out of her. For a moment, it felt like the anger had burned itself out, leaving nothing but ashes behind. I turned back to my bag, zipping it up with finality. I was done arguing, done trying to make her see what she'd done to me. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice calmer, steadier. "I need time to figure out where we go from here. And honestly, Jess, I don't know if there's a way back." She stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch my arm. "Please, Greg," she whispered, her voice so small it almost didn't sound like her. "We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't leave." There was a time when that voice would have broken me, when the tears in her eyes would have made me stop and second-guess everything. But now all I felt was exhaustion. I looked at her hand, hovering near my arm, and felt this overwhelming need to pull away. "Jess, you made your choices," I said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "Now I'm making mine." She stood there, frozen, like she couldn't comprehend that I was actually going to walk away. I grabbed my duffel bag and headed for the door, feeling this strange mixture of numbness and relief. I expected her to say something else, to make one last desperate plea or throw one final accusation my way. But she just stood there, staring at me with this hollow expression, as if realizing for the first time that the narrative she'd been spinning had unraveled completely. As I walked down the stairs and out the front door, the weight that had been pressing down on my chest for months seemed to lift, just a little. The air outside was cold, but it felt refreshing compared to the suffocating tension inside the house. I climbed into my car, threw the bag in the back seat, and sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I picked it up, half expecting another message from Jessica, but it wasn't her this time. It was Rick, my friend who had tipped me off in the first place. I hadn't spoken to him since the Halloween party, mostly because I didn't know how to face anyone after everything that had happened. But there it was, a simple message. "Hey man, heard some things. You good?" It was such a simple question, but it cut through the haze in my mind. You good? Was I? How do you even answer that? I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back a reply. Not really, but I'm getting there. I hit send and put the phone down, feeling the strange mix of pain and clarity. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't questioning myself, wasn't wondering if I was the problem. Jessica had shown me who she was, and now it was my turn to decide who I wanted to be moving forward. I drove back to Dan's place, my mind running a mile a minute. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was accompanied by something else, determination. I wasn't going to let Jessica control the narrative or drag me into her web of half-truths and guilt trips. I was done letting her manipulate me. When I got to Dan's house, he was waiting outside, leaning against his truck with his arms crossed. He didn't say anything when I pulled up, just gave me a nod that said everything I needed to hear. "I've got your back." I got out of the car and walked over to him, feeling this strange sense of solidarity. Dan didn't bombard me with questions or advice. He just asked, "You ready to move on from this?" "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "I think I am." Dan clapped me on the shoulder, and we went inside. We spent the next hour talking about lawyers, custody, what steps to take next. It was all practical, straightforward stuff, but it felt good to have a plan, to take control of something in the midst of all this chaos. Later, as I settled into the spare room at Dan's place, I found myself staring at the ceiling, my mind quieter than it had been in days. I didn't know what the future held or how messy things were going to get with Jessica, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let her gaslight me into believing this was my fault. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could see a path forward, even if it was going to be a rough one. I was still angry, still hurt, but I wasn't broken. I'd been pushed to the edge, but I didn't fall. And that was enough for now. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Dan's coffee grinder buzzing in the kitchen. For a split second, I forgot where I was, but then the events of the past few days hit me like a punch to the gut. Reality had a cruel way of settling in once the adrenaline faded. The spare room at Dan's felt unfamiliar, but it was starting to feel safer than home. I got dressed slowly, running through the upcoming conversations in my head, bracing for whatever Jessica would throw at me next. Dan handed me a mug of coffee when I walked into the kitchen. "You sleep at all?" he asked. Without looking up from the newspaper he was pretending to read. "Some," I lied, taking a sip. We both knew it wasn't true, but Dan let it slide. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy with everything unsaid. My phone was sitting on the kitchen table, lighting up with missed calls and new texts. Jessica hadn't let up. She'd switched tactics overnight from anger to a mix of apologies, bargaining, and threats. One message said, "Greg, please come back home so we can fix this." Another, moments later, read, "You can't just abandon your family like this." She even had the nerve to text, "If you leave, people will know this was your fault too." Like she was trying to manipulate me into thinking leaving made me the bad guy. I knew I had to respond at some point, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't done processing everything yet, and I didn't trust myself not to get pulled back into her narrative. "You talked to a lawyer yet?" Dan asked, breaking the silence. "No, not yet," I admitted. "I haven't even thought that far ahead." "You need to," he said firmly, putting the newspaper down and looking me straight in the eye. "If she's already trying to spin this around on you, she's gonna go full throttle once she realizes you're serious about leaving." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Yeah, I know. I'll call today." After breakfast, I made the call to a local family lawyer recommended by Dan's friend. Just making the appointment felt like crossing some invisible line, a commitment to moving forward no matter how painful it was going to be. When I hung up, my phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't Jessica. It was a text from Tom, my neighbor, the guy who threw the Halloween party where everything blew up. Tom and I weren't exactly close, but we'd had beers together during cookouts, swapped stories about work, and our kids played together sometimes. His text was short, direct. "Hey Greg, can we talk?" I had avoided Tom and Cheryl since that night. I didn't want to face their pity or judgment, but I couldn't ignore him forever. I replied, agreeing to meet him at a diner nearby. When I told Dan I was going to see Tom, he gave me a long look but didn't try to stop me. "Just keep your cool," he advised. The diner was mostly empty when I arrived. Tom was already there, sitting at a corner booth with 2 coffees in front of him. When I walked in, he gave me a small, awkward wave. It was clear he wasn't sure how to handle this meeting either. "Hey, Greg," he greeted, trying to sound casual, but the tension was thick. "Tom," I replied, sliding into the booth across from him. We sat there in awkward silence for a moment. I didn't know what to expect. An apology, an explanation, maybe even some misplaced attempt at advice. But Tom cut straight to the point. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about what happened at the party," he said, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "Cheryl and we didn't know what was going on between you and Jess until that whole scene in the garage." I forced a smile, more out of politeness than anything. "It's not your fault, Tom. Cheryl's been losing her mind over this," he continued, his hands fidgeting with his coffee cup. "You know how she is. She sees everything, hears everything. And she's been telling me that she saw Jess and Mike together more than once. Way before that party. That wasn't a surprise, but hearing it confirmed stung more than I expected." I took a deep breath, trying to focus. "Why didn't she say anything?" I asked, my voice strained. Tom looked pained. She wanted to, man. But she wasn't sure if it was her place. Cheryl didn't have any proof, just suspicions. And you know how these things are. People don't want to get involved in other people's marriages. I nodded, understanding but still feeling a bitter taste in my mouth. Everyone saw the signs except for me. Or maybe I just ignored them, convinced myself I was being paranoid. Either way, I'd been the last to know in my own marriage. I appreciate you telling me, Tom, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need to figure out what to do next. He leaned back in the booth, letting out a heavy sigh. Look, man, I don't know what went down between you two, and it's not my place to tell you what to do. But if there's one thing Cheryl and I agree on, it's that you deserve better than this. That hit harder than I expected. It was one thing to hear it from my brother, but to hear it from someone on the outside, someone who'd seen Jessica and me as a couple, made it feel more real. Thanks, Tom, I said, feeling this strange mixture of gratitude and sadness. He gave me a nod and an awkward pat on the shoulder as we got up to leave, like he wasn't sure how to offer comfort in a situation this messy. When I got back to Dan's place, my phone rang almost immediately. It was Jessica. This time I answered. I couldn't keep avoiding her forever. Greg, she started, her voice low and tense. We need to talk about this before you go and do something stupid. I'm not doing anything stupid, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I just need space, Jess. I don't understand why you're making this such a big deal, she said, exasperation seeping into her tone. We had one argument, and you're blowing up our entire life over it. One argument? I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. This isn't just one argument, Jess. This is about you sneaking around with Mike, lying to me, and then blaming me when you got caught. There was silence on the other end, and then she said, I told you nothing happened. We were just talking. Stop lying, Jess, I snapped, feeling the anger boiling over again. Even if nothing physical happened, you crossed a line, and you know it. You're being dramatic, she shot back, the defensiveness rising in her voice. I told you I was feeling alone, and you just ignored that. So I turned to someone else who actually listened. I let out a bitter laugh. You keep saying that like it justifies everything you did, like it makes lying okay. If you felt alone, why didn't you talk to me instead of sneaking around with him? Because you wouldn't have listened, she yelled, and I could hear her frustration boiling over too. You never listen to me, Greg. You just brush me off. Act like everything I say is some overreaction or nagging. Maybe if you didn't hide everything behind your fake smiles and I'm fine crap, I wouldn't have had to play mind reader. I shot back. You can't blame me for not fixing problems you never brought up. The line went silent, and for a moment, I thought she had hung up. But then she spoke, her voice trembling with what I assumed was anger or guilt. Maybe both. So what now? You're just going to leave? Abandon your family? I'm not abandoning the kids, I said, trying to keep my voice level. But I can't stay with you, not right now. Not until I figure out what the hell is even left of us. There was another long silence. When she finally spoke again, her voice was low and strained. Greg, please, if you leave, this will get out of control. People will find out and they'll think you're the bad guy in all this. That's when it hit me. She wasn't worried about losing me. She was worried about losing control of the narrative. She was still trying to manipulate the story to protect herself. The realization stung, but it also gave me a strange sense of clarity. People will think what they want, I replied, my voice calm but firm. I'm not staying in a lie just to protect your reputation, Jess. She didn't say anything after that. The silence stretched on until I finally hung up, feeling like I'd severed some final thread that had been holding me to the past. Later that evening, I told Dan about the call, and he just nodded. You did what you had to do, he said simply. That night, I sat on the back porch of Dan's house, watching the sun set over the neighborhood. The sky was painted with shades of red and gold, fading slowly into a deep blue as the stars started to appear. It felt like the world was moving on. That night, as the darkness settled in, I stayed on Dan's back porch, watching the stars blink to life. My mind was caught between two worlds, the life I thought I had, and the reality I was only just starting to accept. The house felt quiet, almost like a lull before the storm. I knew I had made the right decision, but there was this gnawing sense of uncertainty about what came next. My phone buzzed again. This time it was from Cheryl. That surprised me. Cheryl and I weren't close, but she'd seen everything unfold and wasn't one to stay silent. Her message was short, almost hesitant. "I'm so sorry, Greg. I can't believe she did this to you. If you ever need to talk, I'm here." I stared at the message for a moment, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and awkwardness. Cheryl wasn't the type to reach out without a reason, and I wondered what she knew that I didn't. I typed back a simple, "Thanks, Cheryl," and put my phone away. The idea of talking to her felt strange. Too many tangled threads in this mess. The next morning, I called my lawyer and scheduled a formal consultation. When the receptionist asked for details, my stomach twisted as I explained the basics. It was like giving an obituary for a marriage that hadn't quite died yet but was in critical condition. I hung up and took a deep breath. Dan was out at work by the time I finished making the call, and the silence in the house was unnerving. I wasn't used to being alone with my thoughts like this. I decided to head back to the house and grab a few more things. Dan had suggested waiting a bit longer, but I wanted to get it over with. The longer I put it off, the more likely I was to lose my resolve. When I pulled into the driveway, Jessica's car was parked outside, which wasn't surprising. I expected her to be there, waiting, probably ready with a new story or another attempt to guilt trip me. The front door was slightly ajar, and the sight of it made me uneasy. It felt like a metaphor for our broken marriage. Barely closed, vulnerable to whatever was lurking outside. I stepped inside, the house eerily quiet except for the faint ticking of that old clock on the living room wall. I could hear Jessica upstairs, moving around in our bedroom. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard the unmistakable sound of her voice, speaking quietly into her phone. I froze, listening without even thinking. "I don't know what to do, Mike," she whispered, her voice choked with anxiety. "He's getting lawyers involved." I didn't think he'd actually leave. Hearing Mike's name again was like being slapped in the face. I felt the blood drain from my head, replaced by a cold, buzzing anger. I knew eavesdropping wasn't the most honorable thing to do, but I couldn't stop myself. "I tried everything," Jessica continued, her voice shaking, "but he's not listening anymore. He's just so angry." There was a pause, and I could imagine Mike on the other end, probably trying to calm her down, telling her it wasn't that bad, that she could still fix things. The thought made me sick. Jessica was still turning to him, even now, even after everything had blown up. "Just stay out of it for now," she said softly. "If Greg finds out we're still talking, it'll only make things worse." That was it. That was all I needed to hear. I turned and walked back down the stairs, my footsteps as silent as I could manage. I couldn't face her right now, not without saying something I'd regret. I headed to the kitchen, grabbing a few more essentials. Documents, some clothes, anything I'd need in case the separation lasted longer than I initially thought. As I was about to leave, I heard her footsteps on the stairs. I turned around, and there she was, her face a mixture of surprise and dread. "Greg," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I didn't know you were here." "I can see that," I replied coldly, trying to keep my anger in check. "I just came to grab some more of my things." Jessica's eyes darted to my duffel bag, her face twisting with something between guilt and desperation. "Can we please just talk?" she asked, taking a tentative step towards me. "I think you've done enough talking, Jess," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. "And I heard plenty." She froze, and I saw the realization dawn on her face. "Greg, it's not what you think. Stop saying that," I snapped, feeling the frustration boiling over. "You keep telling me it's not what I think, but you never actually say what it is. You just dance around the truth, making excuses and blaming me for not understanding. I'm done trying to understand something you refuse to be honest about." She took a shaky breath, her eyes welling up with tears. I just needed someone to talk to," she repeated, as if she could convince me through sheer repetition. "I never meant for it to get this far." "Get this far?" I echoed bitterly. "You mean lying to me? Sneaking around with Mike? And then trying to cover it up even after you got caught?" "It wasn't like that," she insisted, her voice breaking. "You weren't there, Greg. You don't understand how hard it was." "I wasn't there because you never let me be there, Jess," I interrupted, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "You shut me out, lied to my face, and then turned to someone else instead of dealing with the problems we had. Because I didn't think you cared," she yelled back, her voice trembling. "You were so wrapped up in work and everything else that you never saw me, Greg. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter to you anymore." I stared at her, trying to process the words she was throwing at me. Part of me wanted to believe her, to see her as the hurt, lonely wife she was trying to portray. But I couldn't shake the memory of her in that garage with Mike, her dismissive tone when I confronted her, and her constant attempts to spin the blame onto me. Maybe I wasn't the best husband, I admitted quietly, but that doesn't excuse what you did. She didn't respond right away, just stood there, her shoulders slumped, tears running down her cheeks. I could see the cracks in her facade, the weight of everything crashing down on her. But instead of feeling sympathy, I just felt tired of her excuses, tired of being made to feel like the villain in my own story. I'm leaving, I said, more firmly this time. I'm moving forward, Jess. I can't keep doing this. She shook her head, taking another step towards me. Greg, please, she whispered, her voice desperate. We can fix this. I know I messed up, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right. Maybe you are, I replied, feeling the final remnants of anger dissolving into resignation. But I'm not. She looked like I had slapped her, her face crumpling with hurt and disbelief. So, that's it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. You're just going to give up? I let out a long breath, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. No, Jess, I said softly. I'm just done fighting for something you already gave up on. I walked past her, not waiting for a response. As I reached the front door, I heard her sob quietly, but I didn't turn around. Couldn't. If I looked back, I knew I'd see the woman I had once loved. Someone who had shared my life, my dreams, my family. But now, she was just a stranger wearing the face of someone I used to trust. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, feeling the cool breeze hit my face. It was done. There was no going back now. I drove away from the house, feeling the weight of the past few days starting to lift, little by little. I knew the road ahead was going to be rough, full of legal battles, custody talks, and emotional fallout. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life. When I got back to Dan's place, he was waiting on the porch, a beer in each hand. He didn't say anything, just handed me one and clinked his bottle against mine. It wasn't a celebration, but it felt like an acknowledgement that I'd survived something brutal and was still standing. You all right? Dan asked after a while, his voice gruff but kind. Yeah? I replied, feeling the first real smile in days creep onto my face. I think I'm gonna be. We sat there in silence, watching the stars come out, and for once, the quiet didn't feel so heavy. It felt like a new beginning, a hard one, a painful one, but a beginning nonetheless. The days following my final conversation with Jessica were a strange mix of relief and pain. Moving on was proving to be harder than just physically leaving the house. It was like trying to rebuild a life while dragging the ruins of the old one behind you. My kids were still at my parents' place for now. They didn't know the full story yet, and I dreaded the inevitable moment when I'd have to sit them down and explain why Daddy wasn't coming home. My lawyer, Margaret, turned out to be a no-nonsense woman in her mid-50s, with an air of calm authority that made you feel like everything was manageable, even when it wasn't. She didn't waste time sugarcoating anything. As soon as I sat down in her office, she laid out the hard facts. I needed to gather financial records, prepare for custody arrangements, and brace myself for Jessica's potential attempts to control the narrative. You've got to protect yourself, Greg, she said, her voice firm but sympathetic. If she's been lying about the affair, there's a good chance she'll try to twist this in her favor when things get messy. Messy. That was the perfect word for all of this. The more I uncovered, the messier it got. The night before I met the kids, Dan and I talked strategy over a late dinner. He warned me to be careful about what I said to them. They're going to be confused, maybe even angry, he cautioned, poking at his salad with a fork like it personally offended him. But don't badmouth Jess, no matter how tempting it is. They need to figure out their own feelings about her without you adding fuel to the fire. Yeah, I muttered, pushing my food around on my plate. But what if they ask? Dan leaned back in his chair, letting out a sigh. You're their dad, Greg. You just have to be honest without poisoning their view of their mom. It's a tightrope, but you can walk it. I nodded, knowing he was right, but dreading the moment nonetheless. I was so angry with Jessica, but the kids didn't deserve to be caught in that storm. They were innocent in all of this. The next day, I drove to my parents' house, feeling like I was heading to my own execution. My mom met me at the door with a sad smile and a tight hug, whispering, "Just be patient, honey. They're confused." When I walked into the living room, my daughter, Emma, looked up from her coloring book. She's 8, with the same big eyes Jessica has. Eyes that used to make me feel at home, but now only reminded me of what I'd lost. Emma smiled when she saw me, but there was hesitation in it, like she wasn't sure how to feel. "Daddy!" My son Luke shouted, running up to hug me. He's 5, and the way he threw himself into my arms like nothing had changed broke something inside me. Kids have this way of thinking that everything can be fixed if they just love you enough. I wished it were that simple. "Hey, buddy," I said, forcing a smile. "How about we all sit down for a minute?" Emma put her crayons down, looking between me and my parents, who had quietly retreated into the kitchen. She was already piecing things together in that way kids do when the adults around them start acting weird. "What's wrong, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small and hesitant. I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice steady. "Listen, guys, I need to talk to you about something important. Mommy and we're going to be living in different houses for a while." Emma's eyes widened, and Luke just stared at me, confused. "Why?" Emma asked, her voice almost a whisper. This was the part I'd rehearsed 100 times in my head but still felt unprepared for. "Mommy and we're having some problems, and we need some time apart to figure things out," I explained as gently as I could. "But we both love you so much, and that's never going to change." Luke didn't seem to grasp it fully. He just tilted his head and asked, "Are you coming home soon, Daddy?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep the emotion out of my voice. "Not right now, buddy, but you'll still see me a lot, okay? And you can always call me whenever you want." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Are you and Mommy getting a divorce?" she asked, her voice trembling. The word divorce felt so heavy coming from her tiny mouth, like she was carrying a burden she didn't deserve. I paused, not wanting to lie to her but also not wanting to give her more pain than she could handle. "I don't know yet, Emma," I admitted quietly. "We're just trying to figure out what's best for all of us." She wiped her eyes and nodded, not saying anything else. Luke, still not understanding the full gravity of the situation, just asked if he could go back to coloring. I nodded, and he happily ran back to his crayons, oblivious to the storm raging around him. When Emma hugged me goodbye, she whispered, "Please don't leave us, Daddy." It took every ounce of strength not to break down in front of her. "I'm not leaving you, sweetheart," I promised, holding her close. "I'll always be here for you, I promise." After that, I drove back to Dan's house in silence. The conversation had been as painful as I'd expected, but it was a necessary step. I couldn't keep hiding from the reality of what was happening, and neither could the kids. When I got back, there was a voicemail from Jessica waiting on my phone. I hesitated for a moment before listening to it, already bracing myself for whatever she had to say. Her voice was cold, almost robotic, like she was reading from a script. "Greg, I just got off the phone with Cheryl. She told me you've been meeting with lawyers," she said, her tone more accusatory than worried. "Are you really doing this? Are you seriously going to drag our family through court just to make some point?" I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Cheryl must have seen me leaving Margaret's office and mentioned it to Jessica. It wasn't surprising. Small towns like ours thrive on gossip. But the way Jessica framed it was infuriating, like I was doing this to punish her rather than protect myself and the kids. The message continued, her voice growing colder with each sentence. "If you're going to push for a divorce, then we need to talk about custody. I won't let you just take them away from me, Greg. You're not going to turn the kids against me." I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. She still didn't get it. This wasn't about taking the kids away from her. It was about protecting them from the fallout of her choices. But trying to explain that to Jessica was like trying to reason with a brick wall. She was too wrapped up in her own self-preservation to see the damage she was doing to everyone around her. I deleted the voicemail without responding. I wasn't going to let her drag me into another argument. I needed to stay focused on what mattered. The kids, my own mental health, and getting through this with as little collateral damage as possible. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings with lawyers, tense phone calls with Jessica, and long, sleepless nights replaying everything over and over in my head. Emma became quieter during our calls, while Luke seemed blissfully unaware of the storm brewing between his parents. Jessica's attempts to manipulate the narrative didn't stop, but I was learning to see through them more easily. One day, as I was packing up the rest of my things at the house, Cheryl showed up at the front door. She looked uncomfortable, wringing her hands as she waited for me to answer. "Hey, Cheryl," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "What's up?" She shifted on her feet, looking like she'd rather be anywhere but here. "Greg, I wanted to apologize for not telling you sooner," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About Jessica and Mike. I saw things, but I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want to believe it." I nodded, appreciating her honesty even though it didn't change anything. "It's not your fault, Cheryl," I replied, trying to sound more forgiving than I felt. "I probably wouldn't have believed it either, back then." She let out a shaky breath. "You're a good guy, Greg. You didn't deserve any of this." "Thanks," I said, not knowing what else to say. The words felt empty, but I knew she meant well. She hesitated, like she wanted to say more, but I didn't want to dwell on it. I just wanted to move forward. After she left, I stood in the doorway of what used to be my home, taking in the emptiness. It felt like a museum of a life that no longer belonged to me. There were reminders everywhere. Pictures on the wall, furniture we picked out together, little details that held memories I wasn't ready to face. I took one last look around before closing the door behind me. It was time to let go. As I drove back to Dan's place, I felt a strange mix of grief and hope. I was mourning the life I thought I had, the future I had planned with Jessica, but I was also starting to